So who is this guy, Hugo Chavez? I wrote the biography, so I must know a little bit about him, right? Let's see what I know. You know, why did I write this book? Why should you folks read this book? Some of you have bought it already, so hopefully you're going to enjoy it. And you know, what does some gringo from the United States know about Hugo Chavez and Venezuela? Well, the answer really to the first question about why I write or read this book is, I think Chavez's life story is straight out of Hollywood. Whether you love him or hate him, he's got an amazing life story. As the subtitle of the book indicates, he was literally born in a mud hut. All right, so he was born in a mud hut. He's now risen to the top office in his country, and he is sitting atop some of the largest oil reserves in the world. So it's a quite remarkable rags, if not to riches, at least to power story that Chavez embodies. As I said, he was born in this mud hut in the Great Plains of Venezuela, Los Llanos they call it down there, this little tiny town called Sabaneta, in the middle of nowhere basically. The mud hut belonged to his grandmother, who really raised him. His parents were teachers and traveled a lot. So he is delivered in this mud hut in the living room one day by a midwife. There were very few doctors and nurses in this very impoverished area. So he's delivered by a midwife, literally born into poverty. He's so poor that when he goes to school, his grandmother cooks these little candies at home. Chavez has to take them in this glass jar to the school and sell them to his classmates to try to make some money so his grandmother can survive. His first day in class, he shows up in these, battered shoes. The other students mock him, and they were not exactly rich, but his was so bad they actually mocked him. He comes home in tears. His grandmother gets in tears. She finally scrapes up the money for some decent shoes, but it illustrates the poverty that Chavez was born into, and which really, right from the very beginning, begins to shape his view of the world and what he's eventually going to go on to do as president. As a boy, Chavez is nuts about baseball. Baseball is the national sport in Venezuela, unlike the rest of Latin America, where soccer, or football, I guess you folks call it, is king. In Venezuela, baseball was the main sport, still is. It was introduced by American oil workers back in the 1920s when oil was discovered. So Chavez grows up a real fanatic at baseball, and he's really pretty good. He's a pitcher, a left-handed pitcher, in fact. I guess he was even a lefty back in those days, you could say, when he was a little kid. He's very good, and he has a dream. His dream is to become a Major League Baseball player in the United States. The problem is how to get there. No scout is going to discover Chavez in this little village of Sabaneta out in the Great Plains of Venezuela. So he comes up with a plan to get discovered. His plan is to apply to the prestigious military academy of Venezuela, kind of the West Point, to use a U.S. comparison of Venezuela. He figures he's going to get in there. It's in the capital of Caracas. He'll join the military academy's baseball team, and he'll get discovered by a scout within his first year, leave the academy, and go on to his career in Major League Baseball in the United States. He applies to the academy, he gets in, and he shows up in Caracas at the age of 17 in 1971. However, shortly after he arrives, his dream of becoming a Major League Baseball player begins to fade. He actually becomes enamored of the life of a soldier, of the uniform, the pageantry, the drills, the gleaming white building on the military academy campus. He falls in love with this life. His dream of a baseball player begins to fade, and he begins to undergo a transformation. As I said, he grew up in very poor circumstances, but now he begins to get kind of an ideological context to put this all in. It starts when he discovers a guy named Simón Bolívar, who many of you have probably heard of, the libertador of South America, liberated 5 countries, Venezuelan native son. Bolívar is a huge figure in Venezuela. I think in the book I describe him as something like to use U.S. comparisons, a combination of, Jesus Christ, George Washington, and Abraham Lincoln all rolled into one. He's just a bigger-than-life figure. People worship him. So Chavez discovers Bolívar, and he delves into Bolívar's life. He reads until 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. He learns about Bolívar's dream of a united Latin America and his dreams of social justice. So Chavez undergoes this transformation. He travels to Peru during this time, where there's a revolution going on, led by progressive military soldiers and officers, and he kind of begins to think, boy, maybe we could use our military to do something like this. to address the tremendous social injustice in Venezuela. Because the backdrop to all this is that Venezuela is a country incredibly rich in oil, like many of our Middle Eastern countries, and yet this oil wealth is controlled by a very small group of people. It's a white-skinned, ruling oligarchy. They control all this wealth. They live in mansions. I've seen their mansions. I've been inside of some of them. Gated mansions in Caracas. They own homes in Miami and Paris. They fly off to Europe for vacations. Tremendous, tremendous wealth, which is really gained by pretty much raping the country of its oil wealth. They didn't really earn it. In the meantime, you have millions of poor people living in destitution, like Hugo Chavez. People living in mud huts, tin shacks, no running water, incredible destitution, barely enough food to eat. Okay? So this is the social injustice which Chavez faces in Venezuela. He gets out of the military academy after his 4 years, and within 2 years after that, he forms his first conspiracy. Okay? Chavez and some other soldiers, they get together, they talk about this social injustice in Venezuela. They bury a few grenades in the ground. They call it their arsenal, almost as a joke. And this doesn't really go anywhere. But 5 years later, in 1982, Chavez forms a much more serious conspiracy within the military. He forms this really huge clandestine cell. It's made up of hundreds of soldiers. It includes cadets from the military academy, where amazingly the government has sent him back to give classes, even though he's already beginning to feel these feelings of rebellion, and he's beginning to conspire secretly. It includes leftist intellectuals from the universities. It includes former leftist guerrillas who were active in the 1960s. Chavez brings all these people together secretly, and forms this organization all in the name of Simón Bolívar, and all aimed at addressing the social injustice of Venezuela. They don't know how yet, but they know they're angry, and they know they want to do something about it. And the seeds of this rebellion are now planted by 1982, when he forms the first steps of this secret conspiracy. The conspiracy goes on for 10 years. For 10 years, Chavez, a graduate of the West Point of Venezuela, is conspiring secretly against the government. Why would he do that? Why would he put this very promising military career that he has ahead of him, why would he put that on the line and risk it all? Well, because he's so outraged by the social injustice in Venezuela and the corruption. So by day, he's a soldier. By night, he's a conspirator. He lives this way for 10 years. They even have national congresses where they all come together secretly and meet and plot. There's some amazing stories where they get ready to rappel out of buildings if they're caught, and they have ropes they're going to throw out the windows and jump down the ropes if they're caught by security from the military. So it's an amazing story that nobody really knows about, all this part of Chavez's life before he became famous. Finally, his secret movement, they call it the Bolivarian Revolutionary Movement, it reaches a turning point in 1989 when we have an event called the Caracazo Food Riots. And essentially what happens is that the government at that time institutes an IMF economic shock program. It sends prices skyrocketing overnight. The people immediately take to the streets, they begin to riot, and they begin to loot. They go into stores and they take anything they can get their hands on. Flour, rice, eggs, even sides of beef. There are photographs of men carrying sides of beef down the street as they stole this. The government is in a state of shock. They don't know what to do. The looting goes on for about a day and a half. It finally really begins to subside, but nonetheless the government decides to send the military into the streets to, quote, restore order. They go into the streets with an order, basically shoot anything that moves. So that's what they do. They begin to climb up into the mountainside slums of Caracas and other cities, and they simply open fire indiscriminately against apartment buildings and houses. This repression goes on for 3 days. By the end of it, hundreds, if not several thousand people are dead. Most of the victims are actually killed inside their own homes. The looting was pretty much over by then. They were inside their houses. It turns into the worst massacre in modern Venezuelan history, if not modern Latin American history. Chavez and his cohorts in his secret conspiracy are outraged by this. They feel that they have been sent into the street